Greetings and welcome back to our final video on Mark's Gospel. Today we are going to go through Mark 16. It's important right from the outset to notice that Mark 16, if you look closely at your Bible, you will see after verse 8 there are square brackets, usually single square brackets around verses 9 through 11, and then double square brackets on the rest of it. And this bracketing lets us know that the translators feel like these verses are not original to the text of Mark. Instead, they are later additions, and we'll talk more about that. But these are later additions, so we want to really emphasize that Mark 16, 1 through 8 are the uh, are the words of Mark, and then we'll talk a little bit about the endings towards the end of the video. But what we see on Mark 16 is that it's when the Sabbath was over. So Saturday evening, Mary and the Marys and the other women who were at the tomb earlier go out and get the spices necessary for entombing Jesus. They were not able to complete this task before the Sabbath on Friday evening, and so they are going to go out and do that. They get this probably Saturday evening. They get everything ready. They go out to the shops and buy stuff that they'll need on Sunday morning. Now, the reason they are waiting till Sunday morning is obviously for light. This is probably an east-facing tomb, so you would want to wait until dawn to have the best light to work by. So they're not going to go out at night on Saturday evening after sundown. They are going to wait until Sunday morning. Now, we are not told exactly when Jesus rose. It is sometime between Friday and Sunday. We are, kind of clued in that it was probably early Sunday morning, but we're not told explicitly, and nor does that really matter. I know the creeds, the creeds will say he rose again on the third day. But as we have seen in Mark, this language is meant to highlight for us that it was a brief period of time. Today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. A very brief period of time. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be completely taken at face value. It is possible to read this slightly differently, but all that to be said, Jesus in this passage is discovered to be gone on the third day. He is not there. He has risen. At least that's what the message that the women are told. There's a strange young man at the tomb. Now, the importance of the young man is that he is somebody who can provide information to the women. We are not explicitly told he is an angel. Matthew does explicitly tell us of an angel. Actually, he says two angels. Luke describes a person like an angel. Mark just kind of allows you to fill in the gaps with your imagination. Obviously, this individual has some divine characteristic, and it's entirely possible that what Mark is going to do, and again, we don't have a lot of the ending. It is entirely possible that this was Jesus unrecognized. Although that's less likely, it's possible. We see that in John's Gospel where Mary mistakes Jesus for the gardener. It is entirely possible that this person that they encounter was in some way Jesus, but it's probably more likely an angel that they meet. The angel gives them a message. Now here we have what Mark is trying to do. This is the crux of the situation. When this individual gives the women the message that Jesus is not there and that they are to go to Jesus' disciples and explain this to them, we see Mark has established a thread of continuity. He started out at the cross. These women were at the cross. They watched Jesus die. They watched the crucifixion. They know that he died. Then they go to the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea. They follow Joseph So they see where Jesus is buried. Then they are back on the third day at the same tomb, getting the information that Jesus has risen. There is a string of continuous eyewitness to this that Mark is reporting on. These are the women who have spread the message. They started at the cross, they followed Jesus to the tomb, they went back to the tomb, found it empty. It is not like these women, it's not like some women went to the cross and then different women were at the tomb, or Jesus's other disciples, his male disciples, were the ones to find the tomb empty. No, it's the same people who have followed the events. They are valid witnesses because they have walked through this with Jesus, or at least with Jesus's body. So that is what Mark is trying to establish here. It's this line of they saw everything. Now, it's important for us to think about the fact that in Mark's culture, it was highly unlikely that anybody would believe the credibility of a woman when she is testifying about this. Women were seen in lower esteem than men, so their testimony was not inherently trusted. This is important. When we see Paul's letters later, he does not emphasize, well, I should say Paul's letters later, Paul's letters earlier, in the 50s, when Paul was writing, especially to the Corinthians, he does not emphasize the testimony of the women. Instead, he emphasizes the testimony of Peter and John and other men. Now, later, when Mark is writing, Mark's writing probably 10 to 20 years after Paul, but he's recapping with earlier witnesses, earlier testimony. So even if he didn't witness this, he's following along with eyewitnesses. When Mark is writing later, he writes of the original testimony from women. Paul shows us how society at large would have viewed the testimony of these women. They would not have viewed it well. That's why Paul doesn't include it. Instead, he talks about the male disciples who witnessed Jesus. Now, for us, as we think about this, we are met with this idea that for Jesus and his followers, the testimony of these women is valid. It is something that we should accept. In other words, this is raising the status of women. It's also important to note that the message, what the women are told to do, is to proclaim or preach the gospel. So this means that the first people to actually proclaim the good news that Jesus had risen from the dead were the women. The first preachers in the Christian tradition were women. And we have to recognize that and see what the gospel is doing, because it's not, the gospel writers don't always make things obvious. They don't just come out and say, hey, we need to treat women better. They're going to use subtle examples of women being elevated in the culture of the church so that we get comfortable with the idea of elevating women within the culture of the church. And we recognize, oh, well, if it was good enough for Jesus's tomb, it's good enough for us today. So the women are tasked with this message. Now, in the text that we have, they don't deliver the message. And so we're forced to ask, why not? Why don't they deliver this message? Now, there are three possibilities. One is that Mark never wrote an ending and that this was intentional. He intended not to write an ending. Some scholars have tried to make the case that Mark is written as a dramatic play and that the actor who is on stage reciting this at this point is supposed to stop here and then fill in the blank with his own story, his own account, how he became a Christian. And that works really, really well. It works well on the level of us today. We recognize that the story stops here. And we say, well, I know the story stops here. I know Mark's words stop here. But let me tell you about the Jesus that I've encountered. And that really does play well. I don't think it is what Mark intended. I don't think that Mark wanted to stop here. So the options then are that the ending was the book was not completed because Mark died. Some scholars have posted that Mark didn't get a chance to write those last paragraph or two. I don't think that's really likely. I just don't see how Mark would have written all of this and died, and nobody would have filled in the last little bit right away, to a point where we would be arguing about, we kind of look at that last paragraph and go, well, this is an authorship issue. Is this last paragraph Mark or not? I think that we would have different questions if Mark had died and the gospel would have been left unfinished. So the real option, the most likely thing to happen was that one of the earliest copies, the one that every copy that we have was based on, the last paragraph or two got worn away, and people still wanted to, or got ripped off, or some way the manuscript got damaged. This happens all the time. This is very common. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see that the damage is primarily at the top and the bottom of the scroll. That would have been what happened to Mark. And at the very bottom of the scroll, that last few lines got eaten away or got torn off somehow. And yet people wanted to preserve Mark's words, but they did not have the end of it. And rather than writing out the ending from memory, they just wrote it out the way that they knew it, or the way that it was written, which would make sense. But this would have had to have happened very early. We are talking sometime between the late 1st century and the late 2nd century, no later than about 200, because we have copies of Mark from not long after that. So it would have had to have happened very early in the process. And we know this because it ends, the gospel ends with the word "for." I know verse 8 in your translation will say, "for they were afraid." In Greek, that word "for" is never at the start of a sentence. It's always the second word in. And so they were afraid comes first, and then "for." But you wouldn't write a sentence like that. You would keep going. There's more to the story. It's kind of obvious. Had Mark wanted to write a different ending, he wouldn't have written those two words. So we have the idea that they were afraid and they left. Now, we know that this is where we can filter in from the other gospels. We know that something happened, and these women did actually tell what happened to them. They told the story. They might have been afraid at first. They said nothing to anyone. They ran back to the disciples. They said, it could be very well that they said nothing to anyone, or they were afraid, but they ran straight to the disciples and spread the message. As in, the anyone here was the common people on the streets. There's just so much speculation we can make about this, but the important thing is that we know they eventually told people, because we're talking about it today. So if they were the only ones to witness this, they eventually did tell the disciples, and we know the rest of the story from the other gospels. Now, let's talk about the longer ending, or the endings. The first ending, it's called the shorter ending, is probably a little bit, I think that one's the earlier ending. And it reads like a benediction in a church service. It is clearly designed to wrap up the book in a very nice, tidy little bow with kind of a liturgical twist on it. But it does not flow well from verse 8. So we should recognize that it just doesn't complete the thought that Mark had. So we know it's not original. But it is a nice little liturgical way of wrapping up the gospel. The longer ending, this is another attempt at wrapping up the Gospel of Mark, and it draws on Luke 24 and John 20 to talk about how the disciples found out about Jesus and what happened after Jesus' resurrection. Now, both of these editions probably started out as marginal writing. In other words, like we do today, where if you've seen some people, they write in the margins of their Bible, they write little comments and commentary in the margins of their Bible, and then they kind of draw arrows and this and that, and they have their own little ledger. Scribes did the same thing. Now, sometimes a scribe would be copying an earlier manuscript, and they would not understand the difference between a scribe writing something in the margin saying, "Oh, I forgot to put this in," and this is my commentary on the text. It appears that a scribe wrote these little marginal texts, and they would often just copy the marginal text as marginal text. They would copy those notes from other people and put them into the side margins, just like they were originally written. What seems to have happened is these little, we call them glosses, these marginal glosses, a scribe sometime in the maybe 600s, maybe later, copied them into the text. Now, what from there, and this seems to be really kind of primary in the West, the King James Version put them in as the real editions, or the real ending of Mark. Now, the trouble with that is when the King James did something like that, it became the standard for the entirety of the English-speaking world. So even today, it's hard for us to omit these verses, even though scholars do not think that they are authentic to Mark. And we see this in the fact that John 20 is used. Mary Magdalene is standing alone at the grave. That's not in Mark. There's no reason for that. In John's gospel, it is all of the women go. They go back to get Peter and John. Peter and John run to the grave. They don't see anything. Everybody except for Mary stays, or leaves. Mary stays. Now that flows really well in John's gospel because they've gone through all of the stages of, all of the women were there, to Peter and John, to just Mary, who's trying to hang out at the grave a little longer to understand Jesus. In this, it doesn't work as well. Then we have clearly the road to Emmaus in Luke, which again is not set up very well in Mark's gospel. We have no reason for it in Luke's gospel. Luke is telling appearance stories, and he elaborates on that and draws it out and really tells us what the importance is. So again, this is not that these are bad stories or we shouldn't read them. They're condensed versions of Luke 24 and John 20, and they don't fit with Mark. And so we can go to those chapters and read the better versions, and we don't have to worry so much about this version. The last thing I want to really hit on is verse 18, where this is a unique element of the longer ending of Mark, and that is snake handling and drinking poison and these sorts of things. It very much seems like whoever wrote this ending was familiar with the stories of the apostles, stories of Paul being bitten by a snake and having nothing happen to him, stories of Justus. We see this in Eusebius's History of the Church. Justus drinking poison and being completely fine. It very much seems like this verse, and so this whole section was written long after the apostles, because Mark would not have had easy access to some of these stories that he seems to be writing into that little verse there. And it should be noted that this is where literalism can get people in trouble, because people who take these verses very, very literally They tend to go out into the woods in Kentucky and southern Ohio and West Virginia and grab snakes and take them back to church and pass them around in the church service. And sometimes people are bitten, and uh, it has had some bad results. This is a reminder to us that we probably should use a little more discretion when we read the text and to try to understand exactly what it's saying. With all of that said, I hope you've enjoyed the Gospel of Mark. I would love to hear your questions, your comments, and how you interacted with this gospel and what it meant to you. And if you have ideas for where we should go next, please let me know. I'm always excited to see what people come up with. And until we meet again, God bless.